Welcome back to another episode of the Lost Codex. My name is Jesse, and we are doing another feedback video for the Dragonflight Alpha. Now, like last time where I talked about new class race combos that weren't on the Alpha, I'll be talking about something new that's also not on the Alpha, but something that I think would be a huge win for the community if acted on, and that's of course Transmog related. Now for those of you who are interested in the actual feedback and content of this video, go ahead and skip ahead using the timestamp below, otherwise listen to this very short introduction. Now over the last few expansions we have seen the rules on Transmog loosened, whether it was the ability to hide your chest piece, or your bracers, gloves, belt, boots, or the option to change each individual shoulder mog in Shadowlands. All of these were huge wins in the community, absolutely beloved, and I believe the next thing that Blizzard should and could act on is weapon restrictions. Now in this video I won't be talking about armor restrictions, this video will be only about weapon restrictions and why I think it's part of an archaic system that really holds no place in current modern WoW. Now let's get right into it. In today's video, I'll be using the term class silhouette quite often, and to translate for those who don't understand what that means, class silhouette is the idea that you can identify a player class simply by visual means, whether that's the armor they're wearing, the weapons they're wielding, or a combination of both. I believe that class silhouettes once had a purpose in a traditional RPG sense in early WoW, whether it was to sell the idea, the difference between a paladin and a warrior, paladin wearing great golden armor and a heavy war maul, or to sort of differentiate between casters. You've got the battle casters like the mage and the warlocks wielding their swords and offhands, while the battle clerics, the field medics are wielding a scepter and an offhand as priests. But in current WoW, there is no such thing as a class silhouette. There are so many other ways to identify another player simply based off the default UI, which color codes all the classes. There are add-ons out there that tell you which spec your enemy player is, and not to mention, the spell kit the other player uses is a huge indicator on what class they are playing. You're not looking at their weapons, you're not looking at their transmog, you're looking at the default UI, you're looking at the visual effects. There are different aspects to how a class behaves and operates, but your weapon and transmog should not be part of that. That is up. Class silhouette should be up to player choice, not something that's forced upon players for some archaic system that once served a purpose back in 2004. The other huge factor that sort of disrupts the idea that class silhouette is still around is transmog, specifically cosmetics. With tier lookalike armor sets, you can be a paladin wearing a Death Knight set, wielding the most unholy looking weapon possible, yet no one for a second thinks you're a Death Knight, because they can mouse over you, they know you're a paladin, they see you casting holy abilities, there's no doubt, but you are choosing to look like a Death Knight. That is your player choice. So again, where does the class silhouette come into play when you can look like this? It doesn't exist. Especially with cosmetics, the whole concept of heritage armor, anyone can wear it. There are so many different transmogs out there that sort of disguise what you are that you could really throw someone for a loop and say, hey, what kind of class is this? Is this a holy paladin? Is this a protection paladin? No, that's actually a shaman because that weapon's a dagger. There are so many factors out there that disrupt class silhouette, but you're not bamboozled when they're attacking you or standing next to you because you can mouse over them. Their class spell ID kits, there are so many factors out there. Class silhouettes serve no purpose, it is an archaic system, and I hope that if any developers are listening, they'll consider changing some of the weapon restrictions that go hand in hand with class silhouettes for transmog purposes. Now, when I say remove restrictions, I realize that that may be way easier on paper because that suddenly incorporates all sorts of itemization problems. If you're going to start giving one-handed axes to warlocks, does that mean you have to make warlock axes or caster axes? No, I am simply going at this from a transmog direction only. Utility, I completely understand that would be much more complicated, but for transmog purposes, why does a weapon restriction have to be in place for something that made sense back in 2004, 2005, that really doesn't serve a purpose now? Now for the duration of the video, I'm going to go through all of the classes and talk about the weapons they can't use and why many of them, most of them, are really bizarre weapon restrictions. Now let's get right into it. Let's talk about weapon restrictions, and anyone who knows me, anyone who knows the Lost Codex brand, knows what's coming. The weirdest, most bizarre weapon restriction in-game, and that's Warglaives. Now, Warglaives were first introduced into World of Warcraft in the Burning Crusade with the Twin Blades of Azzinoth, the first obtainable Warglaives, I should say, and at the time they were only usable by warriors and rogues, later by monks and death knights. Now, you'll say, oh, demon hunters didn't exist back then, but they probably would have been restricted. I don't think they would have back then, and it's bizarre that weapon restrictions like this exist, considering for gameplay reasons and lore reasons, the restriction holds zero water. It makes absolutely no sense. We have seen many glaives in the game that are obtainable by players, glaive-like weapons. The very popular one is the Fist of Deity from Zul'jin in Zul'Aman and Burning Crusade. We have a bunch of fist weapons and swords from the Fury of Hellfire raid and Warlords of Draenor. All of these sort of serve either the double-bladed or the behind-the-wrist-bladed weapon appearance that glaives have now adopted. And again, they were classified as fist weapons and swords. So why was that okay back then, but suddenly now it's not okay? Now, for story and lore purposes, glaives are used mainly by two races, trolls and a variety of elves. There's probably some sort of historical relevance to trolls using glaives, and that probably is why ancient night elves used glaives. When trolls became night elves, the use of the weapon kind of transitioned over. We don't really know the history of the glaive, but we can assume there's some sort of ancient history there. We know that Darkspear, or not just Darkspear, but shadow hunters of all kinds from all troll tribes are using glaives as shadow hunters. In fact, the most iconic and well-known shadow hunter in great glorious cinematic beauty dies on screen wielding a glaive. Vol'jin dies at the Broken Shore wielding his iconic glaive. We get the cinematic shot with the glaive on the wall, glaives on the wall, and yet he's not a demon hunter. Yeah, he was hunting demons, but he's not a demon hunter, he's a shadow hunter. Trolls use glaives, yet trolls in-game cannot use glaives. Very bizarre. Night Elves are the most iconic glaive-using race, especially with their iconic tri-blade, the Moonglaive, which is seen on their racial crest. We see glaives that were once used in ancient Zinujari as we find them in Nazjatar. Original classic WoW had Night Elves across Kalimdor using glaives of all kind, both the double-sided ones down in Silithus and the tri-bladed ones, whether it was Ashenvale, Darnassus, any zone with Night Elves, there was glaives to be found. Burning Crusade comes out and the Blood Elves in Silvermoon are also using glaives as guards. We saw the iconic Spellbreaker unit in Warcraft 3 and Warcraft 3 Reforged using the double-bladed weapon. Again, these aren't demon hunters, these are Spellbreakers. These are units that have no relation to demon hunters whatsoever. These are guards in Silvermoon City. Even the updated guards in Silvermoon City using the NPC sets are using glaives, and yet they're not demon hunters. So why is a whole unit of guard can iconically use this updated unobtainable weapon, but it's only for one class? It's really bizarre. In Legion, with the introduction of Suramar and the Nightborn, we see that they are also using glaives, very similar to the glaives used by the guards in Silvermoon City. These ones have a more Nightwell magical energy to them, but they are still a double-bladed weapon, not used by demon hunters, but used by an elven unit. Now, in case you think I forgot, I'm going to circle back to Night Elves with the Battle for Azeroth Darkshore revamp and the Darkshore Warfront, because there we get our very first usable Moonglaive. This iconic Night Elven weapon featured on their racial crest, used by units of all kind in the Warfront, whether it's mail units or leather units or plate units, everyone's using it. And do you think it's usable by the Huntresses and Sentinels and Warriors and Priestesses of Elune of the Kaldorei player base? No, it's usable by one class, the fel-addicted, half-demon mutated, blindfold-wearing outcasts of Night Elven society. Again, the weapon restriction is so bizarre when you realize this weapon is quite literally the heritage iconic weapon to Night Elves. yet it is only usable by demon hunters. Death Knights didn't get rune blades as a unique weapon type. Monks didn't get battle staves as a unique weapon type. They got staves and two-handed weapons with runes on them for Death Knights and monks that were just unique to their class. And special demon hunter glaives, that would have made sense. Why is the weapon type locked to one class when there's no gameplay precedence for it, as warriors and rogues used it at the start and later Death Knights and monks, not to mention the one-handed sword and fist weapons that look like glaives, and there's no lore reasons for it. It is a very bizarre restriction, especially when you realize that the design for Warglaives after Legion have had nothing to do with demon hunters whatsoever. Look at this beautiful Kaldorei forged Warglaive for all those Kaldorei human demon hunters, right? And this very obvious troll glaive, something that maybe a shadow hunter would use, taken from Zandalar for all those troll demon hunters, right? Or Forsaken demon hunters. You see what I mean? All these weapon types for all these races, yet the races in question can't actually use them. Now you may be saying, Jesse, for animation purposes, only Demon Hunter Blood Elves and Demon Hunter Night Elves have these animations, and I'll say you're right, there are special animations just for Blood Elves and Demon Hunters, and really, those races should keep those animations for Demon Hunters only. But other races, or non-Demon Hunter Night Elves and non-Demon Hunter Blood Elves, could easily use the one-handed animation that they used for the Warglaives of Azeroth. It worked back then, it's going to work now. Other races can use it even if they don't have the glaive-wielding animations. It's really not that big of a deal. You may say, Jesse, the glaives are what makes a demon hunter unique, and to that I laugh because I say, that's what makes a demon hunter unique? Not the insane movability of your class, not the crazy amount of customization options for Night Elf and Blood Elf Demon Hunters, not the cool fel-infused demon transforming kit or the lasers coming out of your face, not the intense survivability, but the weapon type that you don't even have to use because you can transmog it into an axe or a sword. It's the case of all glaives equals demon hunters, but not all demon hunters equals glaives, which restricts it even more. If demon hunters could only use glaives, alright, maybe my argument wouldn't be as strong. But that's not the case, because they can easily transmog it to something else, and your demon hunter can easily look like a rogue at first glance, until they explode into fel energy and you go, oh, that's clearly not a rogue. Now, which classes should be able to use glaives, you ask? Well, the original four definitely, warriors and rogues, followed by death knights and monks. I believe shamans, specifically enhancement shamans, should be able to use glaives as well for that shadow hunter kind of feel. I think hunters, and I'll get to that later, should be able to use glaives, and this is going to be crazy, but anyone who could use a one-handed sword or dagger really should be able to use glaives. Druids, I think, should be able to use glaives, especially since, you don't really see weapons on druids, so what's the harm in giving them access to this type of weapon for transmog purposes if really they're so limited in their druid forms anyway? Just give it to druids. And casters, let a warlock or a mage or a priestess of a loon, wield a glaive in one hand. They can't dual wield, but give them a glaive for the main hand. What's the harm in that? Like Death Knights and how there's a lot of rune-themed Death Knight weapons, specifically from Legion, or there's some monk-related weapons, I think Demon Hunters deserve some Demon Hunter-only glaives, but the weapon type, the Warglaive weapon type, has zero lore basis, and almost next to no gameplay lore basis for why the restriction should exist. So really, remove it, give it to players, but also give some more special stuff to Demon Hunters. There's a bunch of weapons in the files that never got added that Demon Hunters could wear, could wield, but let other classes have the weapon as well. Why not, Blizzard? Come on! With Warglaives out of the way, we move on to cloth classes, and specifically talking about one-handed weapons. Mages and warlocks can wield swords, but a priest can't. Priests can wield one-handed maces, but your mage or warlock can't. Why? They don't use the weapon in combat anyway, so what does it matter if it's a sword, a mace, or an axe? They can use daggers, they can use staves, they can use wands, so really, what's the harm in adding maces and one-handed axes and warglaives to that equation? It really, there's no harm in it. Sure, you might say, oh, what kind of mage is going to wield an axe? Well, why not? What if you want to go for the lumberjack appearance? Because you can choose to go for a goofy appearance. If you can dual-wield fish, and that's allowed, why can your mage not hold an axe in one hand? Now, moving on from one-handed weapons for casters to two-handed weapons for casters, and they can use staves, they being warlocks, mages, and priests, and shamans, but they can't use polearms. Warriors, monks, druids, and hunters can use both staves and polearms interchangeably, but you can't on a mage, or a warlock, or a priest, or a shaman. Why? I know you're not wielding the actual weapon as those caster types, but really, as a balanced druid, you're not wielding it, right? As a mistweaver, you're not wielding your weapon. So really, what's the harm in allowing for this interchangeability between polearms and staves for transmog purposes? I'm not saying make caster polearms for mages a thing in raid drops, but for transmog purposes, really, why can't they use them? There's so many staves and so many polearms out there that have shared models between them because they use the same weapon animation. What's the harm? This doesn't break any sort of weird boundaries, especially since so many staves look like polearms and so many polearms look like staves. It doesn't really make much sense, and I'll talk about this with the reverse with plate classes later. Warlocks, mages, priests, and shamans should be able to use polearms just as easily as they can use a staff in combat. On to leather classes, and we start with Druid dual-wielding, the iconic Druid of the Claw from Warcraft 3. You see wielding these two awesome fist weapons. You kind of got that class fantasy with your Guardian artifacts in Legion, or for Feral Druids you have the Fangs of Ashmane. But can you actually dual-wield? No! No, you can't. Why? I don't know why. I have no idea why the dual-wielding class fantasy was introduced in Legion, but then not actually given to the class. It's very bizarre. You can turn the Claws of Ursoc or the Fangs of Ashmane into a variety of weapons, but you can't actually dual-wield. So if you want to have that dual furry hand look as a Druid of the Claw, you have one weapon choice, and that's it. So I'm not saying give dual-wielding to Druids for utility purposes, but for transmog purposes, why? You already gave it to them in Legion. Just give it to them now so they can choose, instead of a dagger and an offhand, they could choose to dual wield simply for the sake of aesthetic. Even as resto, they're not going to be using those weapons, so what's the harm in giving them the ability to dual wield for transmog purposes? On that note, they can use one-handed maces, but they can't use axes or swords? There are daggers out there that are the size of two-handed swords that you can choose to wield, but you can't actually use a sword or an axe. The restriction really doesn't make much sense, so a lot of the reasoning for this is going to be why not, and that seems like a weak reasoning for it, but there's no alternative. There's no strong reason to keep these restrictions in place because they come from a day and age where it's just so long ago, class silhouette doesn't matter, it's an archaic reasoning. Let druids dual wield and use these one-handed weapons, give them glaives for that ultimate elven aesthetic, because why not? And on that note, we move on to rogues, specifically assassination and sub-rogues, and this has always baffled me that this is still in place in modern WoW. Their weapon restriction for these specs, they can only use daggers. One class, two specs, cannot use one-handed axes, one-handed swords, one-handed maces, and I believe they can't also use fist weapons when wielding the daggers. Now you may say, oh, a lot of the spec involves backstabbing, and if you try to backstab someone with a mace, it's going to really, really hurt. I promise you, if someone jumped at you from behind and smashed a rolling pin or a club into your spinal cord, it's going to cause a lot of damage. Sure, the animation is going to look weird if you're holding an axe and you do the backstab or the mutilate animation. Sure, it's going to look bizarre. But there is so much clipping with weapons nowadays, the fact that, again, you can use fish, and that's okay, they flop around. let the player decide if that looks weird. If that looks weird and they hate it, guess what? Change your weapon, buddy, and that's it. Don't put a restriction into play. Allow daggers to be transmogged into the weapons that rogues can use. Maces, one-handed axes, one-handed swords, fist weapons, and, hopefully, one day, glaives. Because the fact that this weapon restriction exists still in modern World of Warcraft Shadowlands going on to Dragonflight is mind-boggling to me. I'm convinced that while there are many developers who love transmog, they must have forgotten about rogues because, again, one class, two specs, can only use one weapon type. That is, but at least hunters who are stuck using range for two specs, you have crossbows, guns, and bows. There's options. This is one, this is daggers, and it sucks. Let them use swords, axes, maces, and warglaives and fist weapons. Why not? It doesn't break any sort of idea. I'm sure there's coding issues. I'm sure there's programming issues. I'm not a programmer, so I don't know how difficult this would be. I'm sure there's a challenge there. But if the question is, why should rogues be able to use other weapons as a sub or assassination rogue? Why not? They should be able to backstab you and mutilate you with whatever they can get their hands on. Because rogues are deadly, just let them. There's no reason why a class in modern World of Warcraft should be so restricted on the type of weapon they can use. Now, unlike rogues and druids, monks are in a much more flexible position when it comes to their weapon availability. They can use one-handed weapons, fist weapons, polearms, staves, but they can't use daggers, which is weird. Why can't they use a dagger? In the same way that sub or assassination rogues should be able to use their daggers and turn them into one-handed weapons, monks should be able to do the reverse, turn their one-handed weapons into daggers. They are martial arts experts. Why can't they use all these weapon types? And while we're on the topic, why can't monks use two-handed swords, axes, or maces? They can use polearms, they can use staves. Why can't they use those weapons? They should be able to use the same weapons, or almost the same amount of weapons, that a warrior can use. They should be able to pick and choose, do they want to be a weaponless martial arts expert, or have a weapon? What's the harm in giving monks two-handed swords, two-handed axes, two-handed maces, for transmog purposes, if they can wield these polearms that look like giant clubs, or they can wield these staves that look really heavy? Why can't they wield two-handed swords? There's really no explanation. Let them use two-handed weapons, let them use daggers and glaives. Give monks a little bit more. With that, we're going to move on to hunters, and I'm going to start with survival. Survival hunters have to use a two-handed weapon, whether it's a polearm, staff, two-handed axe, or two-handed sword. But why? Why are they restricted into using a two-handed weapon when the most famous hunters out there are constantly using two weapons? You've got Tyrande Whisperwind using her two glaives. You've got Nathanos using his two axes. You've got Sylvanas, which you may say, oh, she's a marksman hunter. Right, but there's a whole fight where she uses her double daggers. All these hunters are using these iconic dual-wielding abilities. Hunters back in the day used to be able to dual-wield, so why not now? And I realize that that may change up how itemization works, how the whole class works, whether two-handed is better than one-handed. So again, this comes down to transmog only. You may be thinking, Jesse, how can a hunter turn their two-handed polearm into two one-handed weapons? Is that even possible code-wise? I don't know, but it should be, because think back to Legion. Specifically, the end of Legion, right as Battle for Azeroth came out, Holy Paladins for the entire expansion had used a two-handed mace. Now they were going into Battle for Azeroth, where there likely wasn't going to be a whole lot of two-handed maces, and many of them were concerned, damn, I have to give up the silver hand even for transmog purposes. So Blizzard allowed a special Legion artifact transmog category that let you turn your one-handed weapon and shield into your artifact. So you could be wielding a one-handed axe and shield, transmog it into the silver hand. Why can't that work in reverse? Why can't a two-handed polearm be transmogged into two one-handed weapons? Code-wise, programming-wise, no idea how that's going to work. But if it can work one way for artifacts, surely it could work the other way for two-handers to two one-handers. This case also applies to druids, who have the Claws of Ursoc or the Fangs of Ashmain, which technically only count as one slot, even though it covers both weapons. But you could be wielding your polearm, and you could transmog it into the Claws of Ursoc, so you're dual-wielding your fist weapons. If that's possible, surely the reverse is also possible in some way. This would allow survival hunters, not actually using two one-handed weapons, but for mogged purposes, to use two one-handed axes, swords, maces, because why not, and, back to it, glaives, because at this point, hunters, huntresses, sentinels should be able to use glaives. I have always been an advocate for allowing survival hunters to dual wield. A lot of people just want the class designers to go back sort of like single-minded fury for warriors, which I know has caused some problems. Some people love it, some people hate it, whether it's meta or not. I don't want to cause any class problems with the spec or arguments over whether survival should be using two one-handed fast weapons as opposed to one two-hander. So for transmog purposes alone, bring back dual-wielding survival, bring back that iconic class fantasy, not silhouette, class fantasy of a dual-wielding stalker of nature, a huntress or hunter of nature like Nathanos, like Tyrande, like Sylvanas, like Rexar. Bring back this class fantasy for these dual-wielding hunters. And then when you do that, let them use glaives, because hunters are sentinels, sentinels are night elves, and night elves should use glaives. On the topic of hunters and their weapon flexibility, why can they use two-handed swords, two-handed axes, polearms, staves? They can't wield two-handed maces. What's fundamentally different about that compared to the others? I know the difference between a mace and I know the difference between a sword, but really, what's the restriction for? It seems like the restriction is there simply for the purpose of not letting them use all two-handed weapons. They can use axes, they can use swords, polearms and staves. Why? Why can't they use maces? It's really bizarre. And on that note, over to shamans. Why can shamans use one-handed axes, and two-handed axes, and one-handed maces, and two-handed maces, but they can't use swords? What's the fundamental difference between a sword and a mace? Or a sword and an axe? And don't be a smartass and write the actual difference. I'm talking simply for transmog class fantasy. Is it really class fantasy breaking for a shaman to wield a sword? And I get it. Iconic 2004 World of Warcraft shamans were a horde race. They used brutish weapons like axes and maces, while the Alliance and their paladins wielded swords more elegant. But now, the Alliance has shamans, the Horde has paladins. Why can't you be a Draenei shaman with a crystalline sword? Why can't you be a Dwarven shaman with a rune-forged Dwarven sword? Or an Orc Mag'har shaman wielding one of the many Mag'har weapons that came from Warlords of Draenor? There are so many options out there. Is a sword really breaking that sort of class iconic fantasy for shamans? And on the topic of shamans, bring back two-handed enhancement. I know a lot of people are going to be happy when they hear that, and just like a holy paladin is able to take a one-handed weapon and a shield and transmog it into the silver hand, why can't an enhancement shaman take a two one-handed weapons and transmog it into a two-hander simply for the sake of transmog purposes? It may look a little bit funny because of the swing animations and the speed and all that, and let the player decide that, right? It's not going to break anything. It's not going to make any sort of advantage or disadvantage. Let the player decide if they like the look. I realize that bringing two-handed weapons back to enhancement or bringing two one-handed weapons back to survival is super complicated. Just look at single-minded fury, and some warriors love it, some warriors hate it. It's a complicated issue that I wouldn't wish on anyone. But for visual transmog purposes, and I'm sure the coding is complicated, let them have that fantasy. Let the hunters have the two one-hander survival fantasy. Let the shamans have the two-handed enhancement fantasy. It may look wonky with the animations and how they swing, and maybe there's weird clipping, but let the player decide that instead of having such an archaic restriction in place, a restriction that serves really no purpose. It doesn't serve the class silhouette. Give players the option, let them expand on their fantasies as a playable class without actually breaking itemization or introducing new weapon types for the classes to use, whether they're raid drops or dungeon drops. Let them use two-handed weapons as enhancement, and let them use swords. Give them two-handed swords, give them one-handed swords, give them glaives, because why not? Just use the artifact rule, but reverse it. So that's the male classes. Shamans and hunters should both have options, the ability to dual wield or use two-handed weapons, depending which one. Shamans should be able to use swords, two-handed swords, glaives, and polearms for that matter, because they can't use polearms, which I was shocked. Hunters, let them use maces, one-handed, two-handed maces, and glaives. Just open up the options. Let everyone use all these weapons. There's really no restriction. There's really no reason why these classes, or any class, can use or can't use certain melee weapons. And we finish off with the plate classes, where we're going to loop back to the beginning, where we talked about the cloth classes wielding polearms and staves. Warriors can use every weapon, two-handed axes, maces, swords, polearms, staves. Paladins can use two-handed axes, maces, swords, polearms, but not staves. And same with Death Knights. Really, why can't a Paladin or Death Knight wield a staff? They can use all these two-handed weapons, polearms, but they can't wield a staff? Now you may say, Jesse, it may look weird. Staffs are meant for casters, dainty little weapons. Again, that's such a classic WoW mentality when there are staffs that look like this. Does this look so wrong as a Death Knight? Or this Death Knight? Does this Paladin look weird? Does this look right? This is a two-handed sword. This looks weird. But the other ones are wrong? The idea that, oh, staffs belong to casters when there are staffs that look like this is such a weird argument that holds no water in modern day WoW. There is absolutely no reason, lore reason, gameplay reason why this shouldn't be allowed. It is simply a weapon type. Actually, I hold, this might be a bit of a controversial, maybe not. Polearms and staves should be the same weapon type, in my honest opinion. They should be long weapons, they should not be two separate things, combine them. That's my own thoughts on that. Really, Paladins and Death Knights are killing you with their energy and power, not so much their weapon. And even if it is, who cares? You can mog your two-handed weapons to look like the most silliest things possible, so why is this not okay? Doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, now does it? And that's all I have with weapon transmog restrictions. Now I could go on for another hour about, oh, Death Knights can tank with two-handed weapons, but why can't Protection Paladins or Warriors? And frankly, they should be able to. I think it would be kind of weird to do the Avenger shield animation without wearing a shield, but why can't you be holding a giant two-handed maul and just throw a shield made of the light? That's kind of cool. Again, using the Legion transmog system to transmog two weapons into one. Can't it be reversed in the other way? I don't see why not. I don't see why classes shouldn't be able to use all these extra weapons. Again, I'm not saying give crossbows to mages or wands to monks. There are some weapon restrictions that kind of make sense. I'm okay with that. Your Protection Paladin isn't going to go in wielding two little wands. Now you may say, well, why not? And at which point I'll say, fine, give him wands, I don't care. But most of these weapon restrictions are from an archaic day and age of WoW where they were crucial to the class silhouette. But when your Paladin can look like this, or your Shaman can look like this, or your Death Knight can look like this, class silhouette doesn't matter, so why does weapon restriction for transmog related purposes really matter? I really hope some Blizzard developers see this, I really hope some members on the team see this and think about it, because really it's not a matter of why, it's a matter of when, and I realize they have so much on their plate right now. I hope that this makes it in time for Dragonflight at some point, if not 10.0, maybe later on, maybe this can be a longer project. I know there was some struggle with the changing of the individual shoulders with transmog and things like that, and that got added later in Shadowlands. If that's what happens in Dragonflight, I'm okay with it. Just consider it, put it on your radar, Blizzard, talk about weapon restrictions, starting with Warglaives. I gave you a pretty damn convincing argument that Warglaives, for historically gameplay reasons and lore reasons, should be available to everyone. It's not an opinion, it's a fact. Elves use them, trolls use them, we have so many cinematics where they're being used by non-demon hunters. Open the floodgates for glaives, for weapons of all types. Let players choose their class fantasy, or choose not to endorse their class fantasy, to be the fisherman type hobo character, or to be the lumberjack character, or be the guy wearing a loincloth who beats you up with fish kind of character. If you can do that, then why can't your Death Knight have a staff? Why can't your rogue use swords instead of daggers? Why can't your druid dual wield? If these silly things exist, if cosmetics exist, Why do these restrictions remain in place? And if you've made it this far into the video, leave me a comment. What did you think of today's feedback? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you have a 2004 mindset where you think weapon restrictions should remain in place? I disagree with you. I think it's weird. It's archaic. Free the weapons. Do you think Transmog is stupid? Are you one of those weird players who hates Transmog? Who hates Transmog? There are legitimate players out there who think Transmog led to the downfall of this game. To which I say it is easily the most revered, well-received system in World of Warcraft history. But yeah, there's players who hate Transmog. Are you one of those people? In which case, don't leave a comment, because I'm just going to disagree with you. But you're entitled to leave a comment, or downvote, or whatever. Do you think I missed a weapon class restriction that I didn't bring up? Do you believe Warglaives should be usable by only demon hunters? And if you do, please leave a full court case-sized file of explanations as to why they should be, because I provided some pretty solid evidence as to why they shouldn't be, and I know there's not as much evidence suggesting the otherwise. So I would love to hear your opinions on why a single weapon type should be locked to a single class with the fewest amount of playable races, I guess next to the Drac there. Leave a comment, tell me what you thought, and we'll see you guys next time. Until then, goodbye!
You